First, even if one cannot solve the Gettier problems precisely, it is still reasonable to say that knowledge is at least true belief plus something that confers justification, warrant, or rationality on that belief. In this sense, knowledge presupposes truth. There could be truth without knowledge, but no knowledge without truth. Moreover, knowledge is a normative notion. Because it includes the notion of justification or warrant, it involves believing what one epistemically ought to believe, believing what it is right to believe, believing what it is intrinsically valuable or warranted to believe from an intellectual standpoint. Second, when one tries to formulate a definition of knowledge, or more generally, when one investigates matters in epistemology, one does not start with a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as knowledge. Instead, one starts with paradigm cases of knowledge, central, clear cases of where knowledge does or does not obtain. In evaluating the Gettier examples, we constantly appeal to cases that did or did not count as knowledge. We then move from these clear cases to the formulation of various definitions of knowledge that we then use to evaluate alleged cases of knowledge that are less than clear, that is, borderline cases. We start with clear cases of knowledge, formulate definitions and criteria for knowledge justified by those clear cases, and extend these definitions and criteria to less clear cases. In this sense, people already have knowledge and many examples of it before they ever start doing epistemology. This will be important to keep in mind in the next chapter, when skepticism is examined. Third, does knowing something include knowing that one knows it? That is, must one know that he knows something before he can know it? It would seem not, for at least two reasons. First, a farmer can know he owns a tractor without ever reflecting on whether he knows this, without ever asking himself what knowledge is or whether he has it. Knowing that one knows something would seem to require that someone have the concept of what knowledge is in that person's mind, and recognize that his knowledge, say that he owns a tractor, satisfies that conception of knowledge. But it is obvious that many people never reflect on knowledge itself, or on their own states of knowing. Nevertheless, they still have knowledge. Second, if one can know something only by first knowing that he knows it, then this would lead to a vicious infinite regress. Why? Because one could not know that he knows something unless he already knew that he knew that he knew it, and so on. Thus one must be able to know without first knowing that he knows. However, if a person, 1, does know something, 2, has at least an approximate understanding of what knowledge is, and 3, asks himself if he does, in fact, know something, then he can surely know that he knows it. In this way, the study of knowledge does not make knowledge possible, but it does give insight into the intellectual status of what people know by helping them understand that they do have knowledge of the things they know. Here is one final point about knowledge that will be developed in the next chapter. If someone knows something, it does not necessarily mean that the person has complete certainty about that thing. Being completely certain, in this context, means is logically impossible to be mistaken about. This is a pretty high standard for knowledge. It requires it to be logically impossible for someone to be mistaken about a claim before one can know the claim in question. On this view, a test for a knowledge claim is this. If person S knows that P, then it is a logical contradiction to say that S merely takes himself to know that P, but P is false. Descartes thought that I think, therefore I am passed this test, and thus one could indeed know that one existed, because it is contradictory to say, I take it to be the case that I think, therefore I exist, but it is false that I exist. On the other hand, at least at one stage of his argument, that is, without having established the existence of God, Descartes did not think that one could know that the external physical world existed. Why? Because the proposition, I take it that I am seeing an external world, but there is no external world that exists, is not a contradiction. It is logically possible, even though not plausible, that one is hallucinating the external world, merely dreaming about it, or being tricked about its existence by a demon, all while the external world is unreal. Such a requirement for knowledge, complete certainty, is too stringent and eliminates as knowledge many things that we do in fact know. For example, Allison can know that her light is on even though this knowledge is not completely certain. The proposition, Allison takes herself to know that the light is on, but in fact it is not self-contradictory. However, Allison's knowledge that the light is on does not require that this proposition be self-contradictory. Thus one can have knowledge even though it is logically possible that one is mistaken. In fact, we sometimes contrast knowing something with knowing it with certainty, implying that there is a contrast between knowing with certainty and simply knowing. Thus, simple knowing is still knowing, even if it is not for certain. First, there is what can be called Aristotelian rationality. In this sense, Aristotle called man a rational animal. Here, rational refers to a being with ratio, a Latin word referring to the ultimate capacity or power to form concepts, think, deliberate, reflect, have intentionality, mental states like thoughts, beliefs, sensations that are of or about things. Humans are rational animals, in that by nature they have this power of reason. Two things should be kept in mind here. First, other beings besides humans, angels, and perhaps certain animals, have some rational abilities. Second, humans are rational, even if through defect. For example, being a defective newborn, they cannot exercise that power, because the power of reason is possessed simply in virtue of having a human nature. It is important to distinguish between having a power and being able to exercise or develop it. A second sense of rational involves rationality as the deliverances of reason. Here, the faculty of reason is considered a source of certain items of knowledge and is contrasted with the sensory faculties. Thus, according to the traditional view known as rationalism, not to be confused with the view that there is no God or that belief in God is irrational, truths in logic, modus ponens, if P is larger than Q and Q is larger than R, then P is larger than R, and mathematics, 2 plus 2 equals 4, can be known a priori. Roughly, a priori refers to the idea that justification for them does not appeal to sensory experiences, as would justification for an a posteriori claim. For example, there is a tree in the yard. According to rationalism, some a priori truths are self-evident. Upon simply understanding the proposition in question, one can see or feel a strong inclination to accept that the proposition is a necessary truth. It does not just happen to be true, but rather it could not possibly be false. Finally, a third sense of rational is closely connected to justification or warrant. In this sense, to say that a belief, or better, an episode of believing, is rational for some person S at some time T, is to say that the belief has justification or warrant for S at T. It is this third sense of rational that will occupy our attention in the remainder of this section. Rationality and truth. Whatever else one should say about rationality, one thing seems to be of fundamental importance. Rationality has instrumental value as a means to the end of obtaining truth. The claim that a belief is rational means, first and foremost, that we take it to be likely that the belief is true because it is rational. It is only if people think that rationality or epistemic justification constitutes a means to truth that they have any reason for thinking that rationality is cognitively important. Of course, one could still value rationality and not believe in truth in that one could hold rational behavior to be a means to cultural power, happiness, or something else. But if rationality is to be valuable precisely as something related to cognitive and intellectual excellence, then the existence of truth is a necessary condition for such value. This insight suggests that there are two fundamental tasks for people as intellectual, knowing beings. These tasks are to obtain, or at least try to obtain, a set of beliefs that is such that one believes as many truths as possible and avoids believing as many falsehoods as possible, especially in regard to important truths and falsehoods. Now, each of these tasks would be easy to accomplish in the absence of the other. One could believe as many truths as possible by just believing everything that popped into his mind. But in this case, many false beliefs would be accepted in the process. Similarly, one could avoid believing as many falsehoods as possible by simply refusing to believe anything. But because both tasks are central to us as intellectual beings, the need for rationality becomes evident. By learning to be rational and hold beliefs that are justified, people trust that they can increase their stock of true beliefs and decrease their number of false ones. Rationality and epistemic values. When one thinks of rationality as justification or warrant for a belief, it is natural to think of rationality as being intellectually or epistemically valuable. In other words, there is a close connection between rationality and epistemic value. To have a justified belief is to have something of intellectual worth. How should one understand this connection between justification and epistemic value? Philosophers differ over this issue. As noted earlier in the chapter, some thinkers hold to a deontological view of justification. The word deontological comes from the Greek word deon, which means binding duty. According to the deontological view of justification, there are certain epistemic duties or rules, such that if one's beliefs are formed, maintained, and based on, and structured among themselves in accordance with those rules and duties, then they are justified. This means that one has an intellectual right to hold the belief. The belief is either permissible or obligatory to hold, given certain factors and the correct set of epistemic rules. Since epistemic rules are norms governing our reasoning, they state conditions under which it is either rational, permissible, or obligatory to hold a belief, and conditions under which it is irrational, intellectually forbidden to hold a belief. Here are some examples of epistemic norms. 1. If X looks F, for example, red to you, and you have no reason for thinking it isn't F, red, then you are permitted to believe that it is in fact F, red. 2. Try to obtain reasonable beliefs and avoid unreasonable ones. 3. Proportion your beliefs to the evidence. Believe something if and only if there is good evidence to do so. 4. Other things being equal, suppose other people are like you and that they have certain mental states. For example, pain, following certain stimuli, for example, being stuck with a pin, that are similar to yours in analogous circumstances. 5. Accept beliefs that cohere well with your entire set of coherent beliefs. Deontological understandings of rationality assume what is called doxastic voluntarism. Doxastic means having to do with beliefs, as opposed to, say, sensory experiences themselves. The notion that people have at least some voluntary control over and choice about their beliefs, and thus they are intellectually responsible for choosing the right beliefs and avoiding a choice of unreasonable ones. Doxastic voluntarism is a controversial thesis, but it is important to keep in mind that it does not mean one has direct, immediate control over one's beliefs. If someone offered you $1 million to believe right now that a pink elephant was in your room, you could not do it if you wanted to. People's beliefs usually just come to them. Upon looking at a red object, one simply finds himself believing it is red. Nevertheless, one could still have indirect control over a belief. Perhaps people cannot directly change their beliefs, but they may be free to do certain things. For example, study certain evidence and avoid other evidence, to move themselves to a position to change their beliefs. There are other non-deontological views about rationality and justification. On these views, justification does not amount to following correct epistemic rules, but rather it involves exemplifying certain states of affairs that are intrinsically valuable in themselves. Here are some examples of such states of affairs: having beliefs formed by a reliable method, or that are caused by the thing believed, holding more true than false beliefs, forming and maintaining beliefs by means of properly functioning sensory and intellectual faculties, in an environment for which they were designed, having coherent beliefs, and so on. Here, justification is conceived of as forming and maintaining and structuring beliefs in such a way that people embody one or more of these intrinsically valuable states of affairs. But these states of affairs are not to be thought of as rules specifying duties. For example, according to some, a belief is rational if and only if it is formed by a reliable method. But there is no duty to form or try to form your beliefs according to a reliable method. In some, rationality in the sense of justified or warranted beliefs is connected to that which is valuable from an epistemological or intellectual perspective. Either rules people are to follow in forming and maintaining their beliefs, or states of affairs people either do or do not embody in forming and maintaining their beliefs. In Chapter 5, we will look at an important aspect of justification. What structure should one set of beliefs have such that those beliefs do, in fact, have justification for that person? Degrees of rationality. In a certain sense, truth does not come in degrees, nor does it change. The fact that 2 + 2 = 4, or that George Brett retired from baseball in 1993, are either completely true or completely false. Both are true, and their truthfulness does not change over time. By contrast, rationality comes in degrees and can change over time. For any belief P, say the belief that God exists, there are 3 important cognitive postures we can take regarding P. We can believe P, as theists do. We can believe not P, as atheists do. Or we can withhold P, as agnostics do, and neither believe P nor believe not P. Epistemologically speaking, a person should withhold a belief about P if P is counterbalanced for that person. P and not P are equally justified for the person. Neither position is more justified than the other. If one moves from withholding to believing P, or believing not P, his degree of justification can grow and change over time. For example, in a court of law, the evidence for a guilty verdict can grow in such a way that the belief of guilt becomes more and more, or less and less, justified. Moreover, one could have extremely good reasons to hold a person guilty at one time, but given the addition of new evidence, that belief could pass from being well justified to unjustified. Thus rationality, in contrast to truth, comes in degrees and can change over time. One factor that affects whether and to what degree a belief is justified is the presence of defeaters for that belief. Suppose Smith has a belief that Q, for example, that a statue is blue, and suppose that R, for example, the way the statue looks to him, is a reason or ground Smith has for holding to Q. A defeater removes or weakens justification for a belief. There are at least 2 kinds of defeaters. First, there are rebutting defeaters, which directly attack the conclusion or thing being believed. In the case before, a rebutting defeater would be a reason to believe not Q, that is, a reason to believe that the statue is not blue. An example would be a case where the museum director and a number of reliable, honest people assure you that the statue is gray. Second, there are undercutting defeaters. These defeaters do not directly attack the thing believed, by trying to show that it is false, but rather they attack the notion that R is a good reason for Q. Undercutting defeaters do not attack Q directly. They attack R, and in some way undercut R, as a good reason for Q. In the example before, an undercutting defeater would be evidence that there is blue lighting around the statue that makes everything in that room look blue. In the example, the undercutting defeater removes one's reason for thinking that the statue was blue, and the rebutting defeater gives one reason for thinking that the statue is not blue. In different ways, defeaters can remove the justification for a belief. In this chapter, the field of epistemology was introduced, and different aspects of knowledge and rationality were examined. But do people really know or have justified beliefs about anything? This is part of the problem of skepticism, and to skeptical issues we now turn. Chapter Summary. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that focuses on the study of knowledge and justified belief. 4 major areas of epistemology are: 1. The analysis of concepts like knowledge, justification, and rationality. 2. The problem of skepticism. Do people have knowledge or justified beliefs? 3. The sources and scope of knowledge or justified belief. And 4. The study of criteria for knowledge or justified belief. There are 3 types of knowledge: knowledge by acquaintance, know-how, and propositional knowledge. Regarding the last, the standard definition of knowledge has identified it with justified true belief. Gettier-type counterexamples have been raised against the standard definition. Philosophers have responded to these examples in one of 3 ways: reject the examples and retain the standard definition, add a 4th condition to justify true belief, or replace justification with something else, reliability, being suitably caused, to form a new tripartite definition. Whatever one says about this debate, it seems reasonable to affirm this about knowledge: it is normative. People start epistemology with particular cases of knowledge, and not with necessary or sufficient conditions for a definition of knowledge. And people do not have to know they know before they can know. Rationality is another important epistemological notion. We use the term rational in 3 senses: Aristotelian rationality, the deliverances of reason, and rationality as justification or warrant. Regarding the latter, rationality is a means to truth, and it can be understood in terms of fulfilling certain epistemic duties, or embodying certain states of affairs deemed intrinsically valuable from an epistemic point of view. Finally, rationality comes in degrees and can change over time. And one way this takes place is through the presence of different kinds of defeaters. The problem of skepticism. The skeptics were constantly engaged in overthrowing the dogmas of all schools, but enunciated none themselves, and though they would go so far as to bring forward and expound the dogmas of the others, they themselves laid down nothing definitely, not even the laying down of nothing. Diogenes Laertius, Lives of Eminent Philosophers. Prove to me that I do not know them, you who do not deny that such matters pertain to philosophy, and who maintain that none of these things can be known. Augustine, Against the Academicians. Since reason already convinces me that I should abstain from the belief in things which are not entirely certain and indubitable, it will be enough to make me reject them all if I can find in each some ground for doubt. René Descartes, Meditations on First Philosophy, Book 1. Common sense assures us that we all know and have justified beliefs about many things: the external world, God, morality, the past, mathematics, our own mental life, and the existence of other minds. And while Scripture places an important emphasis on faith, it places an equally important emphasis on things we can, should, and do know. Thus Scripture unites with common sense to affirm that there are many examples of knowledge and justified beliefs for human beings. However, we have all met skeptics who, in one way or another, reject this or that item of knowledge or justified belief. And some skeptics claim to reject knowledge or justified belief altogether. This chapter examines skepticism and provides important insights relevant throughout one's intellectual life. Skepticism has had a long and varied history. During the Hellenistic period of ancient Greek philosophy, 2 schools of skepticism arose. The first, known as academic skepticism, flourished in the 3rd and 2nd centuries B.C. It was founded by Arcesilaus, 315 to 240 B.C., a philosopher in Plato's Academy, and was propagated by Carneades in the 2nd century B.C. There is some controversy over what the academic skeptics actually affirmed, but the traditional view is that they asserted 2 things. 1, the skeptical thesis: all things are inapprehensible, no one has any knowledge. 2, regarding the skeptical thesis itself, we can dogmatically affirm that we know that no one has any knowledge. It should be clear that, as stated before, academic skepticism was a difficult position to maintain. For one thing, Statement 2 is self-refuting, because it asserts that people know there is nothing they can know. However, it may be that in asserting the skeptical thesis itself, Statement 1, the academic skeptics did not really say that there is no knowledge at all, but rather that there is only one thing that people know, namely that they cannot know anything else. But this affirmation, while not self-refuting, is still hard to maintain. Is it really possible to know only one thing? Would not a person claiming to know this statement also be implicitly claiming to know that he himself existed, that he knew what the statement meant, that he knew the statement was true, and thus that there was such a thing as truth? Further, if someone can simply assert that there is one exception to the skeptical thesis, namely the thesis itself, what would keep others from simply asserting other exceptions to the thesis, say that they know red is a color? For these and other reasons, a second school of ancient skepticism was more prominent. The second school was called Pyrrhonian skepticism, after its founder, Pyrrho of Elis, 360 to 270 BC. It flourished in Alexandria, Egypt, and reached its zenith in the last great Pyrrhonian, Sextus Empiricus, who lived from AD 160 to 210. This form of skepticism is rooted in the view that philosophy seeks wisdom, and wisdom includes knowledge of truths relevant for living a good, skilled life. The main human problem is unhappiness, and this comes primarily from a disparity between one's desires and what one believes to be true in the world. So the key to dealing with unhappiness is to give up on the search for wisdom, suspend judgment about all of one's beliefs, and be free. The Pyrrhonian skeptics rejected dogmatism and proceeded in three stages. 1. Antithesis. Both sides of an issue are placed in opposition to each other, and skeptical arguments called tropes or modes are used for each side. 2. Epiche, the suspension of judgment. 3. Ataraxia, the ultimate desired state of tranquility. In contrast to the academic skeptics, the Pyrrhonians suspended judgment about all things, including the skeptical thesis itself. With the spread of Christianity and writings critical of skepticism, such as Augustine's Against the Skeptics, skepticism did not flourish until the time of René Descartes, AD 1596 to 1650, when it began to flower again. Descartes set out to refute skepticism and set knowledge on a sure foundation. Especially important in this regard is Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, first published in 1641. Descartes began his quest for knowledge by adopting methodological doubt. This amounted to the idea that knowledge requires absolute certainty, sometimes called Cartesian certainty, and that if it were logically possible to be mistaken about something, then one could not know the thing in question. Armed with methodological doubt, Descartes first argued against knowledge of the external world on the grounds that people's senses sometimes deceive them. Second, he pointed out that people sometimes think there is an external world before them, but they are only dreaming, and that it is logically possible that one is now dreaming and no external world is there. Finally, Descartes opined that a malevolent demon could be tricking people with sensory experiences of an external world when no such world is really out there. The logical possibility of such a malevolent demon meant for Descartes that people cannot know the laws of logic or mathematics, since the demon may be tricking people into accepting these laws, even though they are false. But there is one thing about which the demon could not trick someone: one's own existence, for before one can doubt one's existence, he must exist. This insight was expressed in Descartes' famous maxim, which had been stated in a different form by Augustine: Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This was one secure item of knowledge that could not possibly be doubted. Descartes went on from the cogito to reaffirm knowledge of God, logic and mathematics, and the external world. The details of his procedure are not of importance here. But one thing about Descartes is crucial. He accepted a burden of proof over against the skeptic. One does not know something unless he can prove he does against the skeptic, and that knowledge requires complete certainty to qualify as such. Until now, the purpose has been to illustrate some key episodes in the history of skepticism, to give the reader a feel for what skepticism is. In the remainder of the chapter, 4 items are discussed: the varieties of skepticism, some of the main skeptical arguments for skepticism, different critiques of skepticism, and a brief word about skepticism and naturalistic versions of evolutionary theory. Skepticism is a family of viewpoints and not one simple position. For the purposes of this chapter, 3 forms of skepticism require only a brief mention: iterative, meta-epistemological, and heuristic or methodological skepticism. Iterative skepticism occurs when the skeptic refuses to offer an argument for his view, but instead simply responds to every assertion with the question, "How do you know?" When this question is answered, the iterative skeptic merely repeats the question, and so on indefinitely. This form of skepticism is not a genuine philosophical proposition, since its advocates are not willing to advance arguments against knowledge or accept arguments for knowledge. Iterative skepticism is merely a verbal game, and should be treated as such. Second, meta-epistemological skepticism has been advanced by philosophers like W.V.O. Quine and Richard Rorty. Advocates of this view are skeptical about and reject philosophy, and especially epistemology, as traditionally conceived. For example, epistemology is a normative search for a theory of justification and knowledge, and claim that philosophy is on a continuum with, or merely a part of, natural science. Meta-epistemological skeptics hold to an extreme form of what is called naturalized epistemology. In its stronger versions, this viewpoint implies that epistemology should be naturalized, in the sense that it should be reduced to and treated as a branch of psychology and neurophysiology. Instead of focusing on the normative question of what justifies our beliefs, naturalized epistemology simply describes how people do, in fact, form their beliefs. The task of naturalized epistemology is to describe causal factors and processes in scientific, natural terms as to how people's beliefs are normally, in the statistical sense of typically or usually, formed. Most philosophers reject this extreme form of naturalized epistemology and the meta-epistemological skepticism it entails. For one thing, it leaves out what is crucial to epistemology, the normative element. Traditional epistemology provides an account of justification and knowledge, of epistemic virtues and duties, and of how one decides what one ought and ought not believe. Purely psychological or neurophysiological descriptions of causal, belief-forming processes are merely descriptive, and not normative or prescriptive. Thus, they leave out the crucial normative element in traditional epistemology. Second, it will become evident in chapters 17 through 19 that science has certain philosophical presuppositions. For example, that there is truth, that people do in fact have knowledge and justified beliefs about the external world. Because of this, the epistemic authority of science rests on that of philosophy, including epistemology, not the other way around. Third, while not all philosophers are in agreement about this, some have argued that the statements asserting naturalized epistemology and meta-epistemological skepticism are self-refuting, because they are themselves normative philosophical statements, not scientific ones, that stand in need of justification. A third form of skepticism is heuristic, or methodological skepticism. Here, knowledge and justified belief are acknowledged, and skepticism, especially the question, how does one know that X, and the use of doubt, is taken as a guiding principle to aid people in their search for a better understanding of epistemological issues. In this sense, skepticism is not a position to be refuted or rebutted, but a guiding method to help people understand knowledge. This form of skepticism is indeed very helpful, since doubting and questioning knowledge claims can lead one to deeper understanding. But one must be careful here to distinguish between doubt as a method and doubt as a habitual character trait. The former employs the use of doubt to develop knowledge. The latter is rooted in a skeptical character or heart and is not completely desirable from a Christian perspective, because as Christians we are to cultivate faith and knowledge while at the same time not being gullible or naive. If doubt, understood as a character trait, helps one avoid naivete, then it is an intellectual virtue. If it produces cynicism and a loss of faith, then it is an intellectual vice. Wisdom requires a balanced perspective. We turn, now, to further versions of skepticism, traditionally conceived, versions that express more deeply what skepticism is when viewed as a substantive philosophical thesis. First, there is a distinction between knowledge skepticism and justificational skepticism. Knowledge skepticism is a thesis to the effect that the conditions for knowledge do not obtain, and people do not have knowledge. Justificational skepticism is the same thesis directed not at knowledge, but at justification and justified beliefs. One could be a knowledge skeptic and not a justificational skeptic. For example, one could deny knowledge on the grounds that there is no such thing as truth, and since knowledge includes justified true belief, there is no knowledge, or on the grounds that the standards for knowledge are so high, for example, knowledge requires absolute certainty, that they are never met. But one could go on to accept the claim that people often have justification for their beliefs. Alternatively, one could accept the fact that there is knowledge but be skeptical about the existence of justified beliefs, if that person held that justification is not part of knowledge. Both knowledge and justificational skeptics can direct their skepticism at either the generation, transmission, or sources of belief. That is, the skeptic can direct his arguments against 1. The origination of knowledge or justified beliefs in the first place. For example, the belief that one is experiencing a red sensation generated by the fact that one is indeed having that sensation. 2. The fact that some justified or known beliefs, for example, that one is experiencing a red sensation, transfer justification to other beliefs, for example, that there is in fact a red object before one. Or 3. Entire epistemic faculties that serve as sources of knowledge and justification. For example, against memory, sensory faculties, reason, introspection. In this chapter, we will focus on knowledge skepticism, not justificational skepticism, for 2 reasons. First, much of what is said about knowledge skepticism could be applied to justificational skepticism. Second, part of the task of considering justificational skepticism is the analysis of different theories of justification, and this will be done in Chapter 5. Skeptics also differ on the depth of their skepticism. We have already heard this in regard to the affirmation of the skeptical thesis, academic skeptics being dogmatic and certain about skepticism itself, and Pyrrhonic skeptics being less deep and more tentative about skepticism. But apart from the skeptical thesis itself, skeptics differ in regard to the depth of their position about knowledge in general. Unmitigated skepticism holds its skepticism with greater assurance and certainty than does mitigated skepticism, which is more tentative about knowledge claims. For any item of alleged knowledge, the unmitigated skeptic asserts that it is not a case of knowledge, but a mitigated skeptic is more inclined to withhold judgment about this assertion. Within the category of unmitigated skeptics, there are 3 grades of strength with which unmitigated skepticism is affirmed. Going from stronger to weaker forms of unmitigated skepticism, these grades are as follows. 1. No proposition is knowable. That is, it is not possible for any proposition to be known. 2. While it may be possible for a proposition to be known, as a matter of fact, no proposition is known. 3. While there may be some propositions that are known in some weak sense of that word, nevertheless, no propositions are known with complete certainty. Skeptics also differ in regard to the width or breadth of their skepticism. Global skepticism is the view that there is no knowledge or justified belief in any area of human thought. By contrast, local skepticism allows for knowledge in some areas, for example, in science or in our sensory knowledge of the external world, but local skeptics deny knowledge in this or that specific area, for example, in theology, ethics, mathematics. More specifically, Local skeptics can direct their skepticism at certain alleged objects, faculties, or subject matters of knowledge. If objects are in view, then the skeptic denies that people have knowledge of certain objects or kinds of objects. For example, of other minds, God, causal connections, matter. If faculties are in view, then the skeptic denies that knowledge can be gained by the utilization of some faculty or set of capacities people are supposed to possess. For example, the senses, reason, other forms of intuition. If a certain subject matter is involved, then the skeptic denies that knowledge obtains in that subject matter. For example, history, theology, science, ethics. We will not look at local skepticism in the remainder of this chapter for 3 reasons. First, global skepticism is more interesting from a philosophical point of view, and it is more central because if it is acceptable, then local skepticism follows. Second, it is hard to sustain local skepticism because the considerations that drive it in some specific domain are hard to limit solely to that domain. Skeptical considerations have a tendency to spill out into other areas. Or to change the metaphor, once the camel's nose is in the tent, it is hard to limit the camel's movement throughout the tent. Third, in later chapters, for example, chapters 21 through 22 and 25 through 26, we will examine skepticism about morality and religion, respectively, so we may safely postpone further reflection about local skepticism until then. Finally, there is a distinction between first-order and second-order skepticism. First-order skepticism is the more typical version, and it involves skepticism directed at people's everyday beliefs. That is, beliefs about the external world, there is a tree in the yard, or about an ethical proposition, mercy as such is a virtue. Second-order skepticism is directed at people's beliefs about these other beliefs. Here, the skeptic does not directly question whether people have knowledge of this or that particular item. Rather, he challenges the idea that people know they have this knowledge. It is normally the case that a first-order skeptic will also be a second-order skeptic, because if people do not have knowledge of this or that, then they cannot have knowledge that they do have knowledge of this or that. On the other hand, one could be a second-order skeptic and not a first-order skeptic. One could hold that people know that a tree is in the yard, but that they cannot know that they have this knowledge because such second-order knowledge requires, first, that they have an understanding of what knowledge itself is, and in light of Gettier counterexamples, that understanding is not available. We will not look at all of these different versions of skepticism. Such a task is important, but too detailed for present purposes. But the considerations to follow will often apply, sometimes with minor adjustments, to several different skeptical positions. We will focus our attention on global, unmitigated, first-order knowledge skepticism. Further, we will focus on our sensory knowledge of the external world unless otherwise indicated. However, before we look at arguments for and against such skepticism, we need to get clear on an important purpose for this inquiry. Our goal here, and a major goal of epistemology in general, is to improve our epistemic situation. Part of such an improvement is to gain more knowledge and justified beliefs, and increase the strength of justification for our beliefs that are already justified to some degree, and to remove unjustified or false beliefs from the things we accept. In light of this, a distinction should be drawn between refuting the skeptic and rebutting the skeptic. Refuting the skeptic involves proving that skepticism is false, perhaps even proving this to the skeptic himself. This strategy involves accepting a burden of proof on the part of the cognitivist, the one who accepts the fact that people do have knowledge. By contrast, rebutting the skeptic involves showing that skeptical arguments do not establish the fact that people do not have knowledge. Our primary concern here is not with refuting, but with rebutting the skeptic. Such a stance involves placing the burden of proof on the skeptic, and it expresses at least initial confidence in our noetic equipment, for example, sensory and cognitive faculties. Such an expression of confidence is quite at home in a Christian theistic worldview, because God is a good, trustworthy, rational being who created and designed humans to have knowledge about him and his world. Whether such confidence is justified within an evolutionary naturalistic framework is something we will consider at the end of the chapter. But for now, let us press on in earnest and look at some of the arguments skeptics have offered in defense of their thesis. The argument from error and fallibility. We can all cite cases where we have been wrong in the past. We have mistakenly thought we had knowledge when we did not, or when our senses deceived us. An oar looks bent in the water. Railroad tracks appear to touch in the distance. Ice will feel hot in certain circumstances. We see someone in the dark, recognize him to be a friend, and later find out we were wrong. The skeptic cites this problem, labeled the argument from error, and generalizes it in this way. In each case of past error, we confused appearance with reality and mistakenly thought we had knowledge. How do we know that this is not happening right now? How do we know that this is not universally the case in our sensory awareness of the world? Since we have been mistaken in the past, for all we know, we could always be mistaken in our beliefs. If this is so, how can we claim to have knowledge? How do I know I am not mistaken right now? Evil demons, brain in the vat arguments, and the possibility of error. Perhaps skeptics do not need to argue from the fact that we have been mistaken on occasions. Instead, skeptics may offer various brain in the vat arguments. They simply need to point out that it is merely possible, logically speaking, that we are mistaken in our knowledge claims. And from the mere logical possibility of error, the fact that a skeptical thesis about any putative knowledge claim is not a logical contradiction, it follows that we cannot have knowledge. It is logically possible that an evil demon is tricking us by giving us sensory experiences of an external world when, in fact, no such world exists. Perhaps some scientist has put our brains in a laboratory vat and is stimulating them in such a way that we have a full range of sensory experiences of an external world when no such world is really appearing to us. Since it is logically possible that these things are happening to me, and since there would be nothing in my experience that could indicate this to me one way or another, the brain in the vat and the genuine sensory knowledge of the external world scenarios are empirically equivalent, then I cannot have knowledge, since the skeptical arguments are logically possible. How do I know that these skeptical scenarios are not happening to me right now? 3.3. Transfer of justification arguments. Some skeptics are willing to grant, for the sake of argument, that we do have sensory knowledge that we are presently aware of at this very moment. For example, that there is a green tree before me right now, or that I am having a green sensation now. But we all claim to know many things that go beyond our present sensory experiences. These claims raise transfer of justification arguments, that is, arguments about the transfer of justification to knowledge claims beyond our present experience. For example, cognitivists claim that one can know what is in one's study, even when one is not there, that the sun will rise tomorrow, that since all previously experienced emeralds have been green, then it is likely that all emeralds are green, that the tree before one now was here 10 minutes ago. The problem with all these knowledge claims, says the skeptic, is that they are not entailed by one's present knowledge. That is, one's current belief that there is a green tree before one right now could be true, and the belief that the tree was there 10 minutes ago could be false. Similarly, one's study may be burned down. The sun may not rise tomorrow. Some emerald somewhere may be blue. These are all cases of inductive knowledge, cases where the truth of the premises do not guarantee, but merely lend support to the truth of the conclusions. In the transfer of justification from premises to conclusion, something is lost, an error or loss of justification is possible. The skeptic asks, how do I know in each of these cases that I have not lost my justification for the conclusion, even if it is granted that I know the premise? 4. A critique of skepticism. 4.1. Skepticism and the problem of the criterion. A good way to begin an evaluation of skepticism is to focus on what is called the problem of the criterion. we can distinguish two different questions in epistemology. First, we can ask, what is it that we know? This is a question about the specific items of knowledge we possess and about the extent of our knowledge. Second, we can ask, how do we decide in any given case whether we have knowledge in that case? What are the criteria for knowledge? This is a question about our criteria for knowledge. Now suppose that people wish to sort all of their beliefs into two groups, the true or justified ones and the false or unjustified ones, in order to retain the former and dispose of the latter in their entire set of beliefs. Such a sorting would allow them to improve their epistemic situation and grow in knowledge and justification. But now a problem arises regarding how one is able to proceed in this sorting activity. It would seem that one would need an answer to one of the two questions before in order to proceed. But before one can have an answer to the first question about the extent of knowledge, one would seem to need an answer to the second question about criteria for knowledge. But before one can have an answer to the second question, it seems that one needs an answer to the first question. This is the problem of the criterion. There are three main solutions to the problem. First, there is skepticism. The skeptic claims, among other things, that no cognitivist solution to the problem exists, and thus there is no knowledge. The next two solutions are advocated by cognitivists, who claim that people do have knowledge. Methodism is the name of the second solution, and it has been advocated by philosophers such as John Locke, René Descartes, logical positivists, and others. According to Methodism, one starts the enterprise of knowing with a criterion for what does and does not count as knowledge. In other words, one starts with an answer to question 2 and not question 1. Methodists claim that before one can know some specific proposition P, for example, there is a tree in the yard, one must first know some general criterion Q, and further, one must know that P is a good example of or measures up to Q. For example, Q might be, if you can test some item of belief with the 5 senses, then it can be an item of knowledge. Or perhaps, if something appears to your senses in a certain way, then in the absence of defeaters, you know that the thing is as it appears to you. Unfortunately, Methodism is not a good epistemic strategy, because it leads to vicious, infinite regress. To see this, note that in general, Methodism implies that before one can know anything, P, one must know 2 other things, Q, one's criterion for knowledge, and R, the fact that P satisfies Q. But now the skeptic can ask how it is that one knows Q and R, and the Methodist will have to offer a new criterion, Q prime, that specifies how he knows Q, and R prime that tells how he knows that Q satisfies Q prime. Obviously, the same problem will arise for Q prime and R prime, and a vicious regress is set up. Another way to see this is to note that there have been major debates about what are and are not good criteria for knowledge. Locke offered something akin to the notion that an item of knowledge about the external world must pass the criterion that the item of knowledge must be derived from simple sensory ideas or impressions, roughly, testing it with the senses. By contrast, Descartes offered a radically different criterion. The item of knowledge must be clear, precise, not fuzzy, and distinct, not confused with other ideas, when brought before the mind. If one is a Methodist, how is one to settle disputes about criteria for knowledge? The answer will be that one will have to offer criteria for one's criteria, and so on. It would seem then that Methodism is in trouble. There is a third solution to the problem, known as particularism, advocated by philosophers such as Thomas Reid, Roderick Chisholm, and G.E. Moore. According to particularists, people start by knowing specific, clear items of knowledge, that one had eggs for breakfast this morning, that there was a tree before one, or perhaps that one seems to see a tree, that 7 + 5 = 12, that mercy is a virtue, and so on. One can know some things directly and simply without having to have criteria for how one knows or even that one knows them. People know many things without being able to prove that they do or without fully understanding the things they know. People simply identify clear instances of knowing without applying any criteria for knowledge or justification. One may reflect on these instances and go on to develop criteria for knowledge consistent with them, and then use these criteria to make judgments in borderline cases of knowledge. But the criteria are justified by their congruence with specific instances of knowledge, not the other way around. For example, one may start with moral knowledge, murder is wrong, and legal knowledge, taxes are to be paid by April 15th, and go on to formulate criteria for when something is moral or legal. One could then use these criteria for judging borderline cases, intentionally driving on the wrong side of the street. In general, we start with clear instances of knowledge, formulate criteria based on those clear instances, and extend our knowledge by using those criteria to resolve borderline, unclear cases. The skeptic can raise two basic objections against the particularist. First, particularism allegedly begs the question against the skeptic by simply assuming the point at issue, whether people have knowledge. How does the particularist know that people have this? Is it not possible in the cases cited before that the particularist is wrong and he only thinks he has knowledge? Particularists respond to this objection in at least four ways. First, regarding begging the question, if the skeptic is an iterative skeptic, his question can be ignored because it is not a substantive position or argument. If, on the other hand, a skeptical question is the result of an argument, then this argument must be reasonable before it can be held as a serious objection against knowledge. However, if one did not know some things, one could not reasonably doubt anything. For example, the reason for doubting one's senses now is one's knowledge that they have misled him in the past. Global, unmitigated skepticism is not a rationally defensible position, and the skeptical question cannot be rationally asserted and defended without presupposing knowledge. Second, the skeptic tries to force the particularist to be a Methodist by asking the how do you know question, since the skeptic is implying that before one can know, one must have criteria for knowledge. And the skeptic knows he can refute the Methodist. But the particularist will resist the slide into Methodism by reaffirming that he can know some specific item without having to say how he knows it. Third, the particularist argues that just because it is logically possible that he is mistaken in a specific case of knowledge, that does not mean he is mistaken or that he has any good reason to think he is wrong. And until the skeptic can give him good reason for thinking his instances of knowledge fail, the mere logical possibility that he is wrong will not suffice. The particularist and skeptic have very different approaches to knowledge. For the skeptic, the burden of proof is on the cognitivist. If it is logically possible that one might be mistaken, then knowledge is not present, because knowledge requires certainty. Of the two main tasks of epistemology, obtaining true or justified beliefs and avoiding false or unjustified beliefs, the skeptic elevates the latter and requires that his position be refuted before knowledge can be justified. Moreover, if one asks what it means to have a right to be sure that one has knowledge, two different senses of this phrase are involved. One can dogmatically assert that one has knowledge and refuse to look at further evidence. Or, two, one can have the right to rely on the truth of the belief in explaining things and informing other beliefs while remaining open to further evidence in the future. The skeptic claims that the particularist assertion of knowledge is an example of the former sense of the right to be sure, not the latter. By contrast, the cognitivist places the burden of proof on the skeptic. Just because it is logically possible to be mistaken in a given case, it does not follow that one might be mistaken in an epistemic sense. There is a distinction between a logical might and an epistemic might, in you might be mistaken. The former means that there is no logical contradiction in asserting that a knowledge claim is in error. The latter means that there are good reasons for thinking that one actually is mistaken in a knowledge claim. The particularist claims that all the skeptic provides is the logical possibility of error in certain clear cases of knowledge, but not the epistemic possibility of error, good reasons for thinking one actually is in error, and it is the latter that is required to defeat a knowledge claim. The particularist holds that 1. Knowledge does not require certainty. 2. The burden of proof is on the skeptic, that all the particularist needs to do is rebut, not refute the skeptic. 3. Of the two main tasks of epistemology, having true or justified beliefs takes precedent over avoiding false unjustified beliefs. And 4. The appropriate notion of the right to be sure is the second one. There is one final point the particularist makes in his defense. The particularist claims that his view has advantages over the other two positions. Regarding Methodism, the particularist avoids a vicious infinite regress. Regarding skepticism, particularism accords and skepticism does not accord with the fact that, after all, people do know many things. We are now in a position to understand the dialectic between skeptic and particularist about a second major skeptical objection to particularism. Simply put, the objection is that particularism might easily be abused. One could just go around and assert that he or she knows all kinds of things and sanction this intellectual irresponsibility by claiming to be a particularist. In light of what we have heard before, the particularist response should be clear. Just because it is logically possible to abuse particularism, it does not follow in a particular case that one is actually abusing it. Instead of focusing on generalities and mere logical possibilities, one should look at specific cases of knowledge claims and require that the skeptic give good reasons for thinking that particularism is being abused in that very case. The mere possibility that such an abuse is going on is not sufficient to prove the skeptic's case, and the particularist does not need a criterion for telling when particularism itself is and is not being abused, before he can adopt a particularist standpoint in a specific instance of knowledge. 4.2. Brief responses to the main skeptical arguments. 1. The argument from error. From the fact that one has been mistaken in the past, it does not follow that there are good reasons for thinking that one's senses are currently deceiving him right now. Until such reasons are given as defeaters, one has a right to be sure that one's current sensory beliefs are examples of knowledge. One's current sensory beliefs are prima facie justified, that is, innocent until proven guilty. If something appears red to someone right now, and he forms his belief that something before me is red right now, on that basis, then in the absence of defeaters, factors that refute or undercut one's justification, or perhaps in the absence of being aware of reasons for thinking that there are defeaters, one has a right to be sure of one's sensory belief. Moreover, if people do have knowledge about human fallibility and past deceptions, then obviously they know certain things. 2. Evil demons and the mere possibility of error. Just because it is logically possible that one's current beliefs are mistaken, it does not follow that it is epistemically possible that one is mistaken, that is, that one has any grounds for doubting one's current beliefs. Someone does not need to refute the skeptic before he can know things, and the burden of proof is on the skeptic. The mere suggestion that it is logically possible that one might be mistaken does not meet that burden of proof. Knowledge does not require total certainty. Of course, if the skeptic says that we have grounds for doubting our beliefs, then we must be given those grounds. And we cannot be given grounds for doubting without knowing something that puts us in a position to take the grounds for doubting to be justified. 3. The transfer of justification. Just because a set of grounds or premises does not guarantee a conclusion, it does not follow that people do not know that conclusion. Knowledge does not require absolute certainty. Moreover, people can have inductive knowledge without first having a theory as to how the premises for or grounds of such knowledge transfer justification to the item they know. Our responses here have been brief, because they really represent applications of the issues discussed in the analysis of the problem of the criterion. From our discussion of that problem, it should be evident that the skeptic and the particularist have different attitudes of confidence in the human ability to obtain knowledge, and in the trustworthiness of human noetic equipment. For example, sensory and cognitive faculties. But is it really sensible to have confidence in that equipment? Interestingly, one's worldview will have an effect on how this question should be answered. More specifically, from the time of Darwin to the present, many thinkers have expressed the thought that if naturalistic evolutionary theory is true, we would have little reason to trust our noetic equipment, But if Christian theism is true, we would have good worldview considerations that help to justify such confidence. We will close this chapter with a brief examination of this issue. 5. The epistemology of peer disagreement. In recent years, a new branch of epistemology has come into focus, namely the epistemology of peer disagreement. What do the demands of rationality require one to do when faced with an epistemic peer? Roughly, a cognitive, educational equal who is equally as competent as you and familiar with the same evidence, who disagrees with your conclusions. There are different viewpoints about the right way to approach such situations, but two have risen to prominence: the conformist and the steadfast views. The conformist or conciliatory or equal weight view. According to this position, peer disagreement has enormous epistemic significance. Unless one has a reason independent of the disagreement itself to prefer one's own view, one of two things follows. Either the person cannot rationally hold to P if the peer believes not P, so one must withhold belief about P, or, alternatively, the two peers must split the difference to take into account not only their different views, but also the different degrees of certainty they have. Many, if not most atheists, because I have far less certainty than 6. Evolutionary naturalism and our noetic equipment. Several thinkers, C.S. Lewis, Richard Taylor, and Alvin Plantinga among them, have argued in one way or another that naturalism in general, and evolutionary naturalism in particular, lead to skepticism. This idea is not new. In fact, the same problem troubled Darwin himself. With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all. Chapter summary. Skepticism has had a long history from the ancient academic and Pyrrhonian skeptics up to the present. There are several forms of skepticism. Chapter summary. 6. Evolutionary naturalism and our noetic equipment. Several thinkers, C.S. Lewis, utility, would be successively both strong and weak, according to the successive dispositions of the mind. Reason first appears in possession of the throne, prescribing laws and imposing maxims, with an absolute sway and authority. Her enemy, therefore, is obliged to take shelter under her protection, and by making use of rational arguments to prove the fallaciousness and imbecility of reason, produces, in a manner, a patent under her hand and seal. Chapter summary. Skepticism has had a long history from the ancient academic and Pyrrhonian skeptics up to the present. There are several forms of skepticism. Iterative skeptics merely repeat the question, "How do you know?" Meta-epistemological skeptics are skeptical about philosophy and epistemology themselves, and heuristic skepticism is merely a guiding approach to developing epistemological insights. Knowledge skepticism and justificational skepticism are directed at knowledge and justification, respectively, and utilize arguments against the origination, transfer, or sources of knowledge or justification. Unmitigated skeptics are more certain of skepticism, and mitigated skeptics are more tentative. Global skeptics claim that there is no knowledge in any area of human thought, and local skeptics limit skepticism to a specific object, or kind of object, faculty, or subject matter. First-order skepticism focuses on ordinary beliefs, and second-order skepticism centers on knowing that we know. There is a key difference between refuting and rebutting the skeptic. 3 main skeptical arguments were stated: the argument from error, the argument from the possibility of error, and arguments about the transfer of knowledge. In responding to skepticism, we saw that the central area of focus was the problem of the criterion and its application to the debate among skeptics, Methodists, and particularists. We also discussed the epistemology of peer disagreement by stating and evaluating the 2 chief views in this area of reflection: the conformist view and the steadfast view. part of the debate about skepticism involves confidence in our noetic equipment, and this confidence is, in part, a function of one's overall worldview. In particular, naturalist evolutionary theory fails to have the resources for justifying confidence in the trustworthiness of our noetic equipment. The structure of justification. Now, a truth can come into the mind in two ways, namely, as known in itself and as known through another. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica, Part 1a, Question 84, Article 2. When really pressed, we never anywhere or at any time use any test for truth but one. Coherence is our sole criterion of truth. Brand Blanchard, The Nature of Thought. Constructing a coherence theory of justification without making use of basic apprehensions is not unlike recording your new song by taping other recordings, without ever having given a live performance. Roderick Chisholm, Theory of Knowledge, 3rd edition. Introduction. In the previous 3 chapters, we have looked at the nature of knowledge and rationality, at various skeptical challenges to knowledge and justified belief, and at the different sources and views about the scope of knowledge and justified belief. In all 3 chapters, we had occasion to mention the epistemic notions of justification and justified beliefs, and we have heard at least 2 things about them. First, people do, in fact, have justified beliefs in many areas of cognitive activity. Second, justification is a normative concept, a concept that has to do with positive epistemic appraisal. If we say that a belief has justification, then we say something positive about it from an epistemological point of view, and most likely, justification is a necessary condition for knowledge. In this chapter, we shall look more deeply at the structure of justification and justified beliefs by focusing on the debate between foundationalist and coherentist theories of justification. After a few introductory remarks, we will clarify and evaluate foundationalism and coherentism in that order. The term noetic structure stands for the entire set of propositions that some person, S, believes, together with the various epistemological relations that obtain among those beliefs themselves. For example, some beliefs that apples are red entail other beliefs that apples are colored, plus the relations among S himself and those beliefs. For example, S accepts some beliefs on the basis of other beliefs. Foundationalism and coherentism are normative theories about how a noetic structure ought to be structured, such that the beliefs in that structure are justified for the person possessing that structure. We will accept some beliefs on the basis of accepting other beliefs. Sarah hears a rustling sound outside due to the movement of leaves on her tree. She realizes that a wind is blowing. Her belief that there is a wind blowing is based on and justified by her belief that the leaves are rustling. This second belief is indirect, that is, it is justified mediately, through or by means of the first belief. Now we may ask, what is it that justifies the belief that a wind is blowing? Is it another belief, or is it a sensory experience, the hearing of a sound? In general, suppose P, Q, and R are 3 beliefs accepted by some person, and suppose P is justified on the basis of Q, and Q on the basis of R. We call a chain of beliefs like P, Q, and R, where P is justified on the basis of Q, and Q on the basis of R, an epistemic chain. Now, what should we say about R and its justification? 4 major options suggest themselves. First, R could be justified by S, S by T, and so on. Most philosophers do not accept this option because it seems to exhibit a vicious infinite regress. Second, a person could simply stop the chain of justification with R and say that R is merely an unjustified brute faith assumption. Again, most philosophers have looked unfavorably at this alternative. Why? The justification for P and Q ultimately rests on the justification for R. How can R justify P and Q if R itself has no justification and is merely a brute posit? It cannot. Third, one could stop with R and say that somehow R itself is justified, but not on the basis of some other belief. Perhaps R is self-evident, or produced in a reliable way, or grounded in a sensory experience, but not in a perceptual belief. This is the strategy adopted by foundationalists. Fourth, one could form a circle of justification by asserting that R is justified by P, or form a web of justification by claiming that P, Q, and R all justify each other in a mutually supporting pattern of interaction. This is the coherentist perspective. Foundationalists and coherentists differ on these questions and hold competing views about the nature of noetic structures that exhibit justified beliefs. For the foundationalist, epistemic chains of justification stop with beliefs that are not justified on the basis of other beliefs. For the coherentist, the only thing that justifies a belief is other beliefs, specifically, the fact that the belief in question coheres with other beliefs in the right way. Before we look more deeply at these two schools of thought, we need to make a distinction between a sensation and a belief. Not all philosophers agree here, but according to one traditional account, a sensation is a non-propositional experience possessed by an experiencing subject. If a person has a red sensation, then the person is appeared to in a red-type way. The person has a certain sensory property within his consciousness, namely being and appearing of red. Sensations do not contain beliefs, or, put somewhat differently, simple seeing does not require seeing as or seeing that. If one sees a red apple, then one has a sensation of red, that is appeared to in a red-type way. If one sees the object as red, then one possesses the concept being red, and applies it to the object of perception. Finally, if one sees that this is a red apple, then one accepts the proposition that, and thus has the perceptual belief that, this object is a red apple. In order to have a sensory experience of something, one need not have concepts or propositions in one's mind. By contrast, a belief includes the acceptance of a proposition, and is the way something seems to a subject when he thinks about the belief in question. According to a traditional view, sensations are not propositional. Beliefs are foundationalism. In one form or another, foundationalism has been the dominant theory of epistemic justification throughout most of the history of Western philosophy. Current advocates of some form or another of foundationalism include Roderick Chisholm, Robert Audi, and Alvin Plantinga. Foundationalist theories are distinguished by the notion that all knowledge rests on foundations. More specifically, the foundationalist notes a fundamental division between those beliefs we justifiably accept on the evidential basis of other beliefs. For example, the belief that the wind is blowing is evidentially based on the belief that the leaves are rustling, versus those we justifiably accept in a basic way, that is, not entirely on the basis of the support that they receive from other beliefs. 2.1 Exposition of Foundationalism. For the foundationalist, all beliefs are either basic or non-basic. Basic beliefs are, somehow, immediately justified. All non-basic beliefs are mediately justified in some way by the relationship they sustain to the basic beliefs. For example, the belief that 13 times 12 equals 156 is non-basic and justified by other beliefs. For example, 2 times 3 equals 6, that are basic and immediately justified. The metaphor of a pyramid has sometimes been used to picture foundationalism. Just as upper regions of a pyramid are supported by lower regions and ultimately by the foundation, which is not supported by other parts of the pyramid, so non-basic beliefs are related to basic foundational ones. With this brief sketch of foundationalism in mind, let us look more carefully at some of the details of foundationalism. 2.1.1 Proper Basicality and the Foundations. To begin with, according to foundationalism, there are beliefs that are called properly basic beliefs. Such beliefs are basic in the sense that they are not justified by or based on other beliefs. If we use the term evidence to mean propositional evidence, then evidence refers to cases in which a person, S, believes a proposition, and this serves as the basis for believing another proposition. A properly basic belief is basic in the sense that it is not believed on the basis of evidence. That is, it is not based on belief in another proposition. Moreover, a belief is proper if and only if it is 1, basic, and 2, meets some other condition that specifies why it is proper to take the belief in question as basic. We will look at some of these alleged conditions later, but for now, the point is that not just any old belief should be taken as basic, but only those for which it is proper to do so. Second, there is a difference among foundationalists as to which beliefs ought to be placed in the foundations. According to classical foundationalism, only sensory beliefs or beliefs about the truths of reason should be allowed in the foundations. Other foundationalists claim that additional beliefs should be in the foundations as well. For example, certain moral beliefs, for example, mercy is a virtue, and theological beliefs, for example, God exists. Roughly, a truth of reason is one that can be known independently of sense experience, that is, without requiring a sense experience or sensory belief for its justification. Examples are certain truths of mathematics, necessarily 2 + 2 = 4. Logic, necessarily either P or Q, not P, therefore Q. Or metaphysics, necessarily red is a color. Concerning the last example, one may need to have a sensory experience of redness before one can form the concept of being red required to understand the proposition that necessarily red is a color. But one does not appeal to a sensory experience to justify the proposition. According to one tradition, foundational truths of reason are justified by rational intuition, roughly, the internal awareness of or insight into the facts that make these propositions true. In these cases, one can simply see, that is, rationally intuit, the truth in question. Moreover, limiting the discussion to sensory beliefs about the external world for a moment, one can draw a distinction between ancient and modern classical foundationalism. Ancient classical foundationalism, embraced by Aristotle and Aquinas, is the view that certain sensory beliefs are evident to the senses and should be taken as foundational. For example, beliefs like there is a tree before me, or a red object is there on the table. Note that these beliefs are about objects that exist in the external world outside the consciousness of the believing subject. Modern classical foundationalism, embraced by thinkers from René Descartes to Roderick Chisholm in the 20th century, holds beliefs like the following to be in the foundation. 1. I seem to see a tree. 2. I am being appeared to redly. Here, the beliefs are not about external objects, but instead are about self-presenting properties, that is, psychological attributes, such as sensory states or thinking states, or modes of consciousness within the experiencing subject himself. 1 and 2 are about the way something seems or appears to one from the first-person perspective. Third, foundationalists differ about how strong the justification is for foundational beliefs. Strong foundationalism is the view that foundational beliefs are infallible, certain, indubitable, or incorrigible. These terms are all attempts to get at the same thing, but they differ somewhat in their meaning. A belief is infallible if it is impossible in some sense for a person to hold to the belief and be mistaken about it. Sometimes the term incorrigible is used in the same way. On other occasions, a belief is incorrigible just in case the person holding the belief could never be in a position to correct it. The notion of certainty has two different senses. Sometimes it refers to a certain depth of psychological conviction with which a belief is held. On the other hand, a belief is sometimes called certain in the sense that at least this must be true of it. Accepting that belief is at least as justified as accepting any other belief whatever. Finally, indubitability refers to a feature a belief has when no one could have grounds for doubting the belief in question. For the strong foundationalist, the point of this family of terms is that for a belief to qualify as foundational, it must be as strongly justified as it could possibly be. And it must exhibit certain epistemic immunities. It must be immune to correction, incapable of being doubted reasonably, incapable of being mistakenly believed, and so forth. Weak foundationalists deny that foundational beliefs must have such a strong epistemic status. For them, foundational beliefs must be merely prima facie justified. Very roughly, a belief is prima facie justified for some person just in case that person holds the belief in question and has no good reason to think that he is not justified in doing so. In other words, he has no reason to think that there are defeaters of the belief sufficient on balance to remove his justification for the belief. Fourth, foundationalists differ regarding the conditions necessary for a basic belief to be counted as properly basic. A foundationalist denies that properly basic beliefs can be based on evidence from other beliefs. But the foundationalist still holds that properly basic beliefs must have some kind of ground, that is, have some basis other than another belief. If a properly basic belief is grounded in some way, then the belief receives positive epistemic support or justification, even though there is no evidence for it, no other proposition that serves as the basis for it. Some foundationalists are internalists. Internalism claims that the conditions that ground properly basic beliefs are internal to the knower. For example, the belief is self-evident, or grounded in a sensory or intellectual experience of some sort. For example, the belief that there is a wind blowing gets evidential support from the belief that the leaves are rustling, but this latter belief is properly basic. It receives no support from other beliefs, but is grounded in a sensory experience, a way of being appeared to, in this case hearing the sound of rustling. The belief that 13 times 12 equals 156 received evidential support from the belief that 2 times 3 equals 6. But this latter belief is self-evident. Once one understands the meaning of the proposition, one can simply see that it must be true. What is it that one sees or experiences in this case? Perhaps it is a certain luster or luminosity, or a certain obviousness that is experienced. Or perhaps it is the felt, irresistible inclination to believe the proposition to be true. In any case, the properly basic beliefs are grounded in something, in experience, within the knowing subject. Other foundationalists are externalists, and externalism claims that the factors grounding the justification of a properly basic belief are not those to which the subject must have internal access. Perhaps the belief is caused or reliably produced in a certain way. 2.1.2 The relationship between basic and non-basic beliefs. 3 important issues are involved in clarifying foundationalist perspectives about the relationship between basic and non-basic beliefs. Let us call this relationship the basing relation, sometimes called the believed on the basis of relation. For example, the belief that the leaves are rustling stands in the basing relation to the belief that there is a wind blowing. First, this relation is irreflexive and asymmetrical. A relation is irreflexive if something cannot stand in that relation to itself. For example, larger than is irreflexive since nothing is larger than itself. Applied to beliefs, this means that no belief is based on itself. A self-evident belief is not based on itself, even though it is justified immediately. Rather, it is grounded in its experienced luster or obviousness, in the felt unavoidable inclination to believe it, or in some other way. A relation is asymmetrical, in that, given 2 things A and B, if A stands in that relation to B, then B does not stand in that relation to A. Larger than is asymmetrical. If A is larger than B, B cannot be larger than A. By contrast, the same size as is symmetrical since if A is the same size as B, B is the same size as A. Applied to beliefs, this means that if A is the basis for B, then B cannot be the basis for A. The second issue has to do with the strength of the basing relation, an issue on which foundationalists differ. Historically, some foundationalists claimed that the relationship between a basic and non-basic belief is one of deductive certainty. The basic beliefs entail the truth of the non-basic beliefs. However, most foundationalists deny this today, and for good reason. Many properly basic beliefs support non-basic ones without entailing or guaranteeing the truth of those non-basic beliefs. The belief that the leaves are rustling does not entail the belief that the wind is blowing. The former could be true and the latter false. For this reason, most foundationalists allow for some sort of inductive relation between basic and non-basic beliefs. Foundationalists have had some difficulty clarifying this relationship precisely. Third, foundationalists allow the notion of coherence to play a role in justification. Later, when we examine coherentism, we will look more carefully at just what coherence is supposed to be. But for now, we note that two roles have been assigned to coherence in foundationalist accounts of the support that non-basic beliefs get from basic ones. First, coherence plays a negative function. If one set of beliefs are incoherent, say they contain a logical contradiction, then that counts against that set of beliefs. For example, if one forms 10 perceptual beliefs as one walks around the kitchen table with a red apple on it, and if the first 9 express the idea that one seems to see a red object, but the 10th expresses the idea that one does not seem to see a red, but a blue object, then this 10th belief does not cohere well with the other 9, and that counts against that set of basic beliefs, and more strongly, against the 10th belief itself, serving as a basis for the belief that there is indeed a red object on the table. Second, each member of a set of beliefs can confer some basis on a non-basic belief. But if an entire set of basic beliefs cohere well with each other, this increases the positive support that those beliefs give to the non-basic one. For example, each perceptual belief, for example, one seems to see a red object now, expressed in the example before, gives some support to the belief that there is indeed a red object on the table. But if all 10 express the same notion, and none of the beliefs is that one seems to see a blue object, then the coherence of all 10 beliefs increases one's basis for believing that there really is a red object on the table. Thus, foundationalists allow for coherence to play a role in their overall theory of epistemic justification. Arguments for foundationalism. 2.2.1 The role of experience and perceptual beliefs in justification. Regarding our sensory beliefs about the external world, some foundationalists argue that if we pay careful attention to the way our consciousness actually works, and to the way we actually justify many of our beliefs, then it becomes evident that sensory experiences and perceptual beliefs at the periphery of a body of beliefs, those beliefs more closely related to what we experience in sensation, have a privileged epistemic status. Setting aside the issue of whether our beliefs about our own sensations are incorrigible, our sensory experiences and perceptual beliefs just seem to be immediately justified, or grounded, and to justify less basic beliefs. One's sensory experience of a sound, and one's perceptual belief that he hears a rustling, justify the belief that the wind is blowing in a way depicted by foundationalism. Coherentism allows no room for experience itself to contribute to the justification of our beliefs, since coherentists claim that beliefs and beliefs alone are what confer justification, and coherentism cannot account for the special role perceptual beliefs, such as the belief that one hears a rustling, or sensory experiences play in justification. Coherentists respond to this point in at least 3 ways. First, most coherentists deny the myth of the given, that is, the idea that facts are directly present or given to consciousness in a preconceptual, prejudgmental way. Put differently, they claim that all perception is theory-laden, and that there is no seeing without seeing as or seeing that. However, in spite of this claim, it does seem that we can see things directly. One can be aware of a bird flying overhead and not notice it due to being preoccupied with exam preparation, but later recall the experience to memory and the awareness of the bird can serve as justification for the belief that one saw the bird earlier, or so it would seem. In any case, the theory-ladenness of perception is a point of debate between some foundationalists and coherentists. Second, coherentists claim that whatever is taken to immediately justify a belief, for example, a sensory experience or perceptual belief, can do so only if a person has an argument justifying the idea that the alleged immediate factor has what it takes to function as an immediate justifier. Thus, since the justification of the alleged immediate factor requires this higher or meta-level justification, the original factor is not immediately justified, but mediately justified by some sort of meta-level argument. For example, before the experience of a sound or the perceptual belief that one hears a rustling can be justified, and the justifier of the further belief that the wind is blowing, one must have an argument that the former are, in fact, functioning in this way. Foundationalists respond that there is no sufficient reason to think that this meta-level justification is required to justify what appears to be an immediate justifier of a belief. A sensory experience or perceptual belief can justify a non-basic belief, for example, that the wind is blowing, without the person having to stop first and construct an argument for the fact that this is what is occurring. Third, some coherentists claim that as a matter of psychological fact, sensory experiences are possible without having beliefs. Otherwise, infants or various kinds of animals, or adults in certain circumstances, as in the bird case before, could not have sensory experiences without first having beliefs, and this seems absurd. The beings just mentioned do not clearly have beliefs at all, but surely seem to have sensory experiences. Nevertheless, say some coherentists, the existence of sensory experiences without perceptual beliefs is only a psychological fact and not an epistemological one. That is, psychologically speaking, experiences may exist temporally prior to beliefs, but epistemologically speaking, experiences do not serve to ground or confer justification on beliefs. Foundationalists respond to this third coherentist claim in two ways. First, foundationalism seems to be a theory of justification that is more congruent with the way our sensory and belief-forming processes actually work than is coherentism, and surely this counts against coherentism, since sensations can occur temporally and psychologically prior to perceptual or less basic beliefs. Then if a theory of justification, in this case foundationalism, appropriates this fact in its theory of justification, all things being equal, this counts in favor of that theory. The psychological priority of sensory experience to perceptual beliefs is ad hoc in a coherence theory of justification, foundationalists argue, but it fits naturally in a foundationalist view. Second, foundationalists argue that a major reason coherentists are forced to admit the existence of sensory experiences without beliefs is the fact that such an admission is a better reflection of the way our subjective lives present themselves to us. But a careful description of our subjective lives will contain something else too, the fact that these sensory experiences often serve to ground our perceptual beliefs. The coherentist arbitrarily stops taking account of our subjective lives when it is convenient to do so. Truths of reason. Foundationalists also argue that certain types of a priori knowledge, specifically our knowledge of self-evident truths of reason, fit well into foundationalism and not coherentism. Examples include our knowledge that necessarily 2 + 2 = 4, or that necessarily if A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then A is taller than C. In cases like these, people are justified in believing them without that justification coming from some other things they believe. These truths are self-evident, and the justification for them is immediate. People can simply see that they are necessary truths once they understand them, perhaps by being aware of a certain obviousness or of their strong felt inclination to believe them. This argument has been especially difficult to answer for coherentists. As a result, a popular coherentist response is to adjust his or her coherentism by limiting it to sensory knowledge and by not including knowledge of certain truths of reason 2.2.3 The Regress Argument. To understand the regress argument, recall the epistemic chain mentioned earlier in the chapter, where the belief that P is based on the belief that Q, which in turn is based on the belief that R. There are only 4 options available for understanding such a chain, and the first 2 are clearly inadequate. The vicious regress option, where R is based on S, S on T, and so on to infinity, and the brute posit option, where the regress is stopped with R, taken as an unjustified brute posit accepted by blind faith. This leaves only 2 alternatives: foundationalism, where R is taken as basic, justified, but not on the basis of a further belief, and coherentism, where R is based on P or on mutual coherence relations among P, Q, and R. But, argue foundationalists, coherentist treatments of epistemic chains turn out to be viciously circular, and thus the only reasonable way to construe such chains is the foundationalist way. But why should one think that coherentism is viciously circular? To understand the foundationalist argument here, it may be helpful to focus our attention on cases where A causes the existence of B. Let us refer to this as a case in which A stands in a causal relation to B. Now, such a causal relation is irreflexive. A cannot cause itself, because this would require A to exist prior to its own existence in order to cause its existence, and that is absurd. It is also asymmetrical. If A causes B, then B cannot cause A, because B cannot cause A to exist unless B already exists. But B cannot exist without A causing it to do so. Thus A would be causing B to cause A, or in short, A would cause itself to exist, and that is absurd. Now, if the causal relation is irreflexive and asymmetrical, then it must be non-circular. That is, if A, one's hand moving, causes B the moving of the broom, and B causes C the moving of the dirt, then C cannot cause A, because this would really amount to the claim that A had some role in causing itself. Now, the epistemic relation called the basic relation, P is believed on the basis of or justified by the belief that Q is irreflexive and asymmetrical as well. Thus, at least some coherentist versions of justification are viciously circular, because in asserting that P is based on Q, and Q on R, and R on P, the coherentist implicitly asserts that each belief is at least partly based on itself. In this way, we see that the foundationalist notion of a basic perceptual belief or sensory experience is a sort of epistemological unmoved mover. It confers justification on other beliefs without needing justification to be conferred on it by something else. Later in the chapter, we will examine coherentism in more detail, and we will look at coherentist attempts to circumvent this argument. 2.3 Arguments against foundationalism. 2.3.1 Incorrigibility of the foundations. The main objection to classical foundationalism is the claim that there simply are no incorrigible, or infallible, certain, indubitable beliefs. Critics of strong foundationalism cite ways that alleged incorrigible beliefs could turn out to be corrigible or fallible, and use these counter-examples to argue against the existence of incorrigible beliefs. Foundationalists respond to this strategy in 2 different ways. First, some foundationalists accept the criticism and adopt weak foundationalism, which takes basic beliefs to be prima facie justified and not incorrigible. The essence of foundationalism is the existence of properly basic beliefs, and the asymmetry between basic and non-basic beliefs, not the degree of strength possessed by properly basic beliefs. Thus, the debate between foundationalism and coherentism is not primarily a debate about the existence of incorrigible beliefs. Second, other foundationalists attempt to respond to the arguments and reassert the existence of incorrigible beliefs. In order to understand this dialogue, suppose one has a red sensation, that is, one is appeared to redly. Now, if the person reflects on his own sensory experience and believes that he is being appeared to redly, then if such a belief is incorrigible, he is being appeared to redly. In general, if being R is a self-presenting property, for example, being appeared to readily, if person S is R, for example, S is appeared to readily, and if on that ground S believes himself or herself to be R, then it is incorrigible for S that he or she is R. Recall that a self-presenting property is a psychological attribute, a mode of consciousness, a property of a first-person mental state. Sensory properties are self-presenting. In the statement before, R could be a red sensory experience, or, more precisely, the property of having a red image, or, preferably, being appeared to readily. Thus, if person P is being appeared to readily, and if grounded in this sensory state, P believes himself to be appeared to readily, for example, he reflects on his own sensation and forms this belief, then it is incorrigible, infallible, etc., for S that he is, in fact, being appeared to readily. The idea here is that one can know one's sensory states incorrigibly. But this idea needs to be qualified, for there do seem to be certain sources of error here. For example, one can have a false belief about a present sensation if one's memory is poor, and he groups it with past sensations in the wrong way. Thus, one may mistakenly compare his present red sensation with past orange sensations, and mistakenly believe, due to poor memory, that this is a sensation like those orange sensations. In this and other ways, one could use the wrong word, orange, to report the present sensation to others. Second, one could have a sensation in his visual field, and due to preoccupation and inattention, fail to notice it, and later deny having had the sensation. In this case, one has a vague awareness of a sensation, perhaps a clear sensation. Third, one can have a clear awareness of a vague sensation that serves as a source of error. This one could be aware of a person at 150 yards, and mistakenly believe that his sensation is of his friend Bill, due to the fact that the person and his face appear vague and undefined to the perceiver. Fourth, one can have a very complex sensation, taken as a whole, that can be a source of error because some of one's beliefs about the whole sensation require the use of memory. Thus, one can be aware of 24 dots on a wall, but report that his sensation is one by means of which only 22 dots appear to him. In this case, he must count the dots in his visual field, so he is actually having a number of different sensations as he counts each dot, and he is holding past sensations of counted dots in his memory to finish the count. An error could occur due to a mistake in memory. Now, the strong foundationalist can admit all of this, but still ask, if we limit ourselves to whole sensations that are simple enough to be present before the mind in their entirety, in one simple act of noticing, such as a state of being appeared to readily taken by itself, can one be mistaken about this if one believes oneself to be appeared to readily, and one's belief is grounded in that appearance? Perhaps, but it is hard to see how. Critics offer certain counterexamples that purport to show that one can be mistaken in these cases. For example, some argue that before one's belief that one is being appeared to readily can have any content to it, one or both of two things must be true. First, one must have a general conception of what it is for something to be a red sensation, derived from comparing one's current sensation with similar ones in the past, and then go on to judge that the present sensation fits the class of red sensations accurately. Second, before one's belief that one is being appeared to readily can have any content, one must have mastered language. For example, one knows how to use the terms being appeared to, read, and so forth, because people can think only in language. And surely, the critic continues, one cannot report to others what one's sensation is unless one uses language. Either way, there are sources of error because one can always use language in a mistaken way. Both of these arguments seem to be mistaken. First, before one can be aware of what a current sensation is, or have a belief about it, that person does not first have to compare it with other sensations, for two reasons. For one thing, this idea, that before one can have a justified belief about one thing, for example, one's current sensation, one must have justified beliefs about two other things, for example, other sensations similar to this one, and the judgment that this present sensation falls into a certain class of sensations, leads to a vicious infinite regress of justification, and fails to allow for what for many people would be an obvious fact, that one can be directly and simply aware of some things and form beliefs about them without making comparative judgments at all. For another thing, this idea has the correct order backward. Before one can form classes of sensation based on memory and similarity judgments, for example, the class of all red sensations, one must first be able to be aware of and form beliefs about individual sensations. Regarding the second argument about language, it mistakenly assumes that people must think in language. But this does not seem to be the case. People often experience themselves to be thinking rapidly, without any sensory signs flying through their minds, and infants and other creatures seem to be able to think without having acquired a language. Moreover, if people could not think without a language, how could someone ever enter into a language to learn it in the first place? Finally, we must distinguish between having a true belief about my present sensation, which arguably can be incorrigible, versus using language to tell someone else about the sensation, which, through misreporting or other sources of error listed before, can be mistaken. The two are different things. Another counterexample to incorrigibility is this. Suppose a brain physiologist located that part of the brain associated with a person's being appeared to redly, and could use a reliable machine to monitor that part of the brain. Now suppose the person believed he was being appeared to redly, but the brain monitor indicated otherwise. In this case, couldn't the person be mistaken and thus have a corrigible belief about his current sensation? In response, it could be pointed out that this argument begs the question. If such a belief is incorrigible, the brain physiologist should not continue to insist that the person was not having a red sensation. After all, his monitor was developed by correlating brain readings with first-person reports as to what sensations a subject was having while his brain was doing such and such. Thus, the reliability of the monitor is based on the justification of first-person reports in the first place. If it is used to undercut the authority of first-person reports, this, in turn, undercuts its own reliability. In sum, the arguments against incorrigibility are not conclusive, but philosophers are divided about this issue. But even if there are no incorrigible beliefs, all that follows is that strong as opposed to weak foundationalism is in trouble. 3.2. All perception is theory-laden. This argument amounts to the claim that all perception is theory-laden, that there is no seeing without seeing as, or seeing that, and thus there are no basic sensory experiences, no uninterpreted data, nothing merely given to consciousness. Further, all perceptual beliefs, and, indeed, all beliefs whatever, involve a theoretical interpretation of some sort. From this, two things follow. First, no perceptual beliefs are immune from error, since theories can be changed and interpretations corrected, at least in principle. Second, theories are, among other things, coherent webs or networks of interrelated beliefs. Since perceptual beliefs are really part of theoretical networks that get their support from their coherence with other beliefs in a theory, this means that such beliefs are not basic, as the foundationalist supposes. We have already considered the issue of the theory-ladenness of perception in this chapter. The important thing to note here is that the issue is closely related to the foundationalist-coherentist debate, the former denying and the latter affirming the theory-ladenness of all perception. 2.3.3. The transfer of justification. Finally, coherentists claim that foundationalists have not clarified the relationship between basic and non-basic beliefs in a way that explains how the former transfer justification to the latter. Moreover, the actual beliefs in the foundations are too slim in number and content to serve as a sufficient floor for constructing the edifice of all the things we are justified in believing. For these reasons, Foundationalism must be rejected. Regarding the first objection, foundationalists have, indeed, had some difficulty clarifying the relation between basic beliefs. For example, a number of beliefs of the following sort formed while walking around a table. I am being appeared to redly now, and non-basic ones. For example, there is a red apple on the table. The relation is not deductive. The former could be true and the latter false, nor are non-basic beliefs reached by enumerative induction. For example, one does not take an inductive sample of, say, 1,000 cases of having a red sensation where there was actually a red object, and go on to claim that probably there is a red apple now before one on the basis of 1. One's current red sensation, and 2. The frequency with which such sensations are, indeed, correlated with external objects of perception. And while foundationalists continue to work on this problem, the best thing they can say at present is that coherentists fare no better on this score, due to various ambiguities in trying to clarify the notion of coherence. We will look at this shortly. Regarding the second objection, that the actual beliefs in the foundation are too slim in number or content to serve as an adequate basis for justification, it is beyond the scope of this chapter to deal with this problem. But foundationalists must work out detailed theories of justification in which it becomes plausible to suggest that the foundational beliefs are, in fact, sufficient as a ground on which to build the edifice of justification. And some foundationalists, such as Robert Audi and Roderick Chisholm, believe they have already done so. 3. Coherentism. 3.1. Coherentism explained. Our treatment of coherentism can be briefer than our discussion of foundationalism because many of the issues have already surfaced. There are several versions of coherentism that differ from one another in one way or another, but the essence of coherentism lies in the fact that there are no asymmetries between basic and non-basic beliefs. All beliefs are on a par with each other, and the main, or more likely, sole source of the justification of a belief is the fact that the belief apparently coheres with the other beliefs in one's noetic structure. Important coherentists have been F. H. Bradley, Brand Blanchard, and more recently Keith Lehrer and Nicholas Rescher. As we have stated it, coherentism is a theory about epistemic justification. But there are two other types of coherentism that are often, though not always, associated with coherence theories of justification. First, there are coherence theories of belief, or meaning. These are theories that claim, in one way or another, that the content of a belief, the thing that makes a belief what it is the role the belief plays in an entire system of beliefs. This position is sometimes called the holist theory of meaning. Second, there are coherence theories of truth. Roughly, the notion that a proposition is true if and only if it is part of a coherent set of propositions. This theory of truth contrasts with the correspondence theory of truth. Roughly, the notion that the truth of a proposition is a function of its correspondence with the external world. Theories of truth will be mentioned later in this chapter and in Chapter 6. But for now, it should be pointed out that one could consistently hold to a coherence theory of justification and a correspondence theory of truth. Our concern at the moment is with the former, and we need to characterize it in more detail. 3.1.1 Coherentism and the doxastic assumption. The doxastic assumption, from the Greek doxa, belief, refers to the view that the sole factor that justifies a belief for a person is the other beliefs that the person holds. So understood, coherentists, at least strong coherentists, accept the doxastic assumption. Sensory experiences, for example being appeared to redly, themselves serve no role in grounding beliefs, even perceptual beliefs, and in general, a belief acquires no justification whatever from its relationship to experience. Nor do externalist factors, like the proper functioning of one's sensory faculties, play a role in justification. Only a belief, or set of beliefs, can confer justification on another belief. This means, among other things, that all versions of coherentism are internalist theories, whereas foundationalist theories can be either internalist or externalist in orientation. 3.1.2 No asymmetries between basic and non-basic beliefs. For the coherentist, there is no basic, privileged class of beliefs. For example, those expressing perceptual beliefs such as, I am being appeared to readily now, that serve as a foundation for justifying other beliefs, but that need no justification from other beliefs. Our noetic structure does not, or should not, have such asymmetries in it. If the pyramid is a metaphor for a foundationalist picture of a good noetic structure, many think that a raft is a metaphor for a coherentist picture. Moreover, all sensory experiences are therefore laden, and thus turn out to be perceptual judgments, not non-propositional ways of being appeared to. In one's overall set of beliefs, there may be those closer to the periphery of experience than others, but this is just a matter of degree, not of difference in kind. 3.1.3 The nature of coherence itself. The basic idea here is that what justifies a belief is the way it coheres with other beliefs in one's noetic structure. A better way to put this is to say that a belief is justified for a person just in case the belief is a member of a coherent set of beliefs for that person. Justification is primarily a feature of individual beliefs. Coherence is a feature, not of individual beliefs, but of an entire set of beliefs taken as a whole. For example, if a person wonders how he knows that the wind is blowing, he could say that the leaves are rustling. If asked how he knows that, he could respond that he knows that he hears the leaves rustling, and further, he knows that he hears leaves rustling because the wind is in fact blowing. Here, each belief is justified by being a part of a coherent set of beliefs. Coherentists have been divided about their views as to just what coherence itself amounts to. In this way, they are like foundationalists who have been divided about the best account of the justification relation between basic and non-basic beliefs. Almost all coherentists agree that coherence must at least mean logical consistency. That is, a set of beliefs cannot explicitly or implicitly contain contradictory propositions, P and not P. But this alone is not enough. A person could believe that he was Napoleon, that everyone else denied he was Napoleon, but that they all were conspiring to lie. This would be a logically consistent set, but hardly one that confers justification on the members of the set. Different coherentists have added further conditions on what coherence must include. One candidate has been entailment coherence. A set of beliefs is coherent only if each member of the set is entailed by all the other members of the set. Another more popular candidate is called explanatory coherence. Each member of a set of beliefs helps to explain and is explained by the other members of the set. As a set of beliefs grows in size, the coherence of the set, and thus the justification of each member of the set, increases as the mutual explanatory power among the beliefs in the set grows in quality and strength. Still another candidate is called probability coherence. A set of beliefs is coherent only if it does not include the belief that P and the belief that P is improbable. 3.1.4 Varieties of coherence theories. Finally, a taxonomy of coherence theories will include different versions of coherentism. First, there is positive and negative coherentism. According to the former, if a belief coheres with a set of beliefs, then that provides positive justification for the belief. Here, positive reasons are required before a belief can be justified, and coherence provides that justification. According to negative coherentism, if a belief fails to cohere with the set of beliefs, then the belief is unjustified. Here, beliefs are innocent until proven guilty. That is, they are justified to some degree unless they fail to pass the test of coherence. Second, there is weak and strong coherentism. Weak coherence theories imply that coherence is but one determinant of justification, and thus weak coherentism is compatible with versions of foundationalism that allow coherence to play a role in justification. Strong coherence theories assert that coherence is the sole determinant of justification. This version of coherentism will be evaluated shortly. Finally, there is a difference between linear and holistic coherentism. According to linear coherentism, beliefs are justified by other individual beliefs, or small sets of belief, in a linear circular chain. Thus, P justifies Q, Q justifies R, and so on in a single inferential line until the loop is completed. If the loop is rich and large enough, it confers justification on its members. Holistic coherentism affirms that in order for some person S to be justified in believing P, P must be in a coherent relation with the set of all of that person's beliefs. It is the entire pattern of interlocking, mutual coherence that provides justification. 3.2. Coherentism Evaluated. We have already encountered most of the main arguments for coherentism in our evaluation of foundationalism. In fact, much of the support for coherentism lies in the alleged failure of foundationalism, coupled with the view that coherentism is the only viable alternative. The denial of basic beliefs and of the asymmetry between basic and non-basic beliefs. The inadequacy of the foundations to support all that people are justified in believing. The weaknesses in foundationalist accounts of the relationship between basic and non-basic beliefs, the theory-ladenness of all perception, and so on. In addition to this essentially negative argument for coherentism, coherentists are convinced about the correctness of their account of how it is that people actually go about justifying their beliefs. Coherentists claim that if we pay careful attention to the way beliefs are justified, the correctness of coherentism becomes manifest. In spite of this claim, a number of serious criticisms have been raised against strong coherence theories of justification. These criticisms tend to cluster around three main issues. First, there is an objection that focuses on the vicious circularity and implausibility of coherence views of the transfer of justification from one belief to another. Consider linear positive coherentism. On this view, the transfer of justification proceeds in a linear circle. P justifies Q, Q justifies R, and so on, until the loop is closed with Z justifying P. The problem here is that the loop is viciously circular and implausible. Regarding vicious circularity, recall what was said earlier in the chapter in this context. The basis relation is like the causal relation. Both are irreflexive. A cannot cause or be the basis of itself, and asymmetrical. If A causes or is the basis of B, then B cannot cause or be the basis of A. But this means that no belief can be the basis of itself in whole or in part, and this is what linear positive coherentism requires. P justifies a chain, R, S, and so on to Z, and that chain in turn justifies P. But the chain cannot justify P if it is not justified. Thus, R through Z justify P because P justifies them, and in this sense, P helps to justify itself. And the same will be true of other members of the chain. Moreover, such a circle of justification is not only viciously circular, but also implausible in its treatment of perceptual beliefs. Suppose Frank sees that a red apple is on the table and believes this to be so. The foundationalist could justify this by referring to Frank's belief that he is being appeared to redly, which in turn is grounded in the fact that he is indeed having the perceptual experience in question. But the coherentist must justify Frank's belief about the apple by looping back up to higher order beliefs, those farther away from Frank's immediate experience. For example, ordinary physical object beliefs, that a table has been in the room for a long time, that a friend placed an apple on the desk an hour ago, that the lighting in the room is normal, that no one else has come into the room since then, etc., which are, in turn, based on other ordinary physical object beliefs. Tables don't disappear randomly. No one usually takes one's furniture. When a friend brings an apple, he doesn't come back later and take it home. Or the coherentist can justify Frank's belief about the apple by reference to a second-order belief that he believes the red apple is there. Now, the problem with these strategies is that they are implausible as accounts of how the belief is actually justified, namely, by reference to Frank's present experience of the apple being on the table. Coherentists respond to this charge by denying that experiences themselves can ground a belief, because all sensations are theory-laden, and only beliefs can justify other beliefs. But the point of the objection here is to show that this notion of justification simply seems implausible in light of what people actually find to be the justifying factors in their ordinary perceptual beliefs. What about the problem of vicious circularity? Coherentists respond to this problem in at least two ways. First, some claim that if a circle of justification is small, then circularity is indeed vicious. But if the circle is large and contains a lot of members in the loop, then circular justification is not problematic. However, this assertion fails as an argument. It may be a psychological fact about us that if a circle of justification is large enough, people will not be bothered by it because they will not become aware of the circularity and its inadequacy. But the problem of viciousness, rooted in the irreflexive, asymmetrical nature of the relation by which justification is transferred, is present in small or large loops. A second response is to abandon linear positive coherentism and adopt holistic coherentism. On this account, coherentism is a view not about the transfer of justification, but about its source. That is, the essence of coherentism is the idea that the mutual holistic coherence among the beliefs in a web of beliefs is the source that confers justification on those beliefs. Coherentism is not primarily a view about how that justification, once it is present due to coherence, is transferred from one belief to another. However, even if holistic coherentism avoids the problem of circularity, it still suffers from implausibility due to an important factor. It does not allow for sensory experience or reason. In the case of knowledge of truths of reason, as in logic and mathematics, to contribute to the justification of our beliefs. The fact that one is appeared to readily, or that one can simply see that 2 plus 2 equals 4, does seem to play a crucial role in justification, in spite of what coherentism implies. In short, there are sources of justification besides coherence. This leads us to a second major objection to coherentism, the isolation problem. There are several closely related difficulties that are usually associated with this problem. For one thing, some have argued that coherence theories cut justification off from the external world and the way that world really is. Justification is solely a function of the internal relations among beliefs in one's noetic structure, their coherence, and thus justification has nothing to do with anything outside one set of beliefs, as does one's sensory experiences, such as the external world, or truth, which is a relationship between our beliefs and that external world. Since the objective of justification is to give us knowledge of that external world, then if coherence theories leave us cut off from that world, they must be inadequate theories of justification. Coherentists have responded to this problem in one of three ways. First, some have abandoned a correspondence theory of truth and have added a coherence theory of truth to a coherence theory of justification. Here, truth is not a correspondence relation between a proposition and the external world. Instead, to say that a proposition is true is to say that it is a member of a set of coherent propositions. And just as coherence can be a matter of degree, a set of beliefs can be more or less coherent, so truth is a matter of degree. The reason that justification gives us truth is that both are to be understood in terms of coherence. As our beliefs become more and more justified, due to their being members of increasingly more coherent sets of beliefs, we come closer to true beliefs, because the truth of a belief is a matter of its being a member of a coherent set of beliefs. We cannot evaluate this response here. Theories of truth will be discussed in Chapter 6. But if truth itself does not come in degrees, and if the correspondence theory of truth is superior to the coherence theory, then this response is inadequate. A second response by some coherentists claims that the notion of a theory-independent world, or of there being something called the way the world is, available from a God's eye perspective, is incoherent. Our only notion of an external world, or of the way the world is one that reduces to the idea of the way the world is in a given theory or set of beliefs. There is no single way the world is. There are only different worlds and different theories. Thus, the theory-world distinction ultimately breaks down. This response denies a realist view that there is, in fact, a world independent of theory, mind, language. We will consider this issue more fully in Chapter 8. Finally, some coherentists respond that the external world does, in their view, influence our beliefs about that world, in that our beliefs are caused by inputs from the external world. For example, wavelengths impinging on our sensory organs. Thus, the external world does not play a role in justifying our beliefs, but it does play a causal role in producing and influencing the beliefs we actually have. The problem with this response is that it leaves no room for the external world. For example, our direct awareness of that world to play a rational role in justifying our beliefs. And it is this role that is of relevance to epistemology. This last remark leads to a second difficulty related to the isolation problem. Coherentism leaves no room for experience or other factors. For example, the trustworthiness of our sensory and cognitive equipment to play a role in justification, since beliefs and beliefs alone are relevant to justification. For the coherentist, the justification of a belief is solely a function of the coherence of that belief with other beliefs. If one holds the same set of beliefs in two different circumstances, then any belief he holds will have the same degree of justification, even if sensory experiences or factors outside the believing subject change drastically. This means, among other things, that coherentists cannot supply the criteria needed to distinguish between coherent illusions that do not have justifications. For example, coherent fairy tales, dreams, or dysfunctional, hallucinatory sets of beliefs, and equally coherent sets of beliefs that do have justification. Thus, coherence is not sufficient for justification. Here are two examples cited by Alvin Plantinga that show the insufficiency of coherence theories of justification. Oliver Sacks recounts the case of the lost mariner who suffered from Korsakoff syndrome, a profound and permanent devastation of memory caused by alcoholic destruction of the mammillary bodies in the brain. He completely forgot a 30-year stretch of his life, believing that he was 19 years old when in fact he was 49. He believed it was 1945 when in fact it was 1975. His beliefs, we may stipulate, were coherent, but many of them, due to this devastating pathology, had little or no warrant. Finally, consider the case of the epistemically inflexible climber. Rick is climbing Guide's Wall on Storm Point in the Grand Tetons. Having just led the difficult next-to-last pitch, he is seated on a comfortable ledge, bringing his partner up. He believes that Cascade Canyon is down to his left, that the cliffs of Mount Owen are directly in front of him, that there is a hawk gliding in lazy circles 200 feet below him, that he is wearing his new fire rock shoes, and so on. His beliefs, we may stipulate, are coherent. Now add that Rick is struck by a wayward burst of high-energy radiation. This induces a cognitive malfunction. His beliefs become fixed, no longer responsive to changes in experience. No matter what his experience, his beliefs remain the same. At the cost of considerable effort, his partner gets him down, and in a desperate last-ditch attempt at therapy, takes him to the opera in nearby Jackson, where the New York Metropolitan Opera on tour is performing La Traviata. Rick is appeared to in the same way as everyone else there. He is inundated by wave after wave of golden sound. Sadly enough, the effort at therapy fails. Rick's beliefs remain fixed and wholly unresponsive to his experience. He still believes that he is on the belay ledge at the top of the next-to-last pitch of Guide's Wall, that Cascade Canyon is down to his left, and so on. Furthermore, since he believes the very same things he believed when seated on the ledge, his beliefs are coherent. But surely they have little or no warrant for him. The reason is cognitive malfunction. His beliefs are not appropriately responsive to his experience. There is a third difficulty related to the isolation problem, called the plurality objection. There could be two or more equally coherent sets of beliefs that could, nevertheless, be logically incompatible with each other. A schizophrenic person who thinks he is John the Baptist could have a set of beliefs equally coherent with those of his therapist. In this case, the coherentist would have to say that the beliefs in each set are equally justified. But surely this is not the case. Only one set of beliefs is true, and it would seem that only one set contains justified beliefs, namely those of the therapist. Besides vicious circularity and the isolation problem, some have raised difficulties against the notion of coherence itself, claiming that it is either inadequate or too unclear to be satisfactory. Space does not allow for an analysis of these problems, and in any case, the same claim has been made against foundationalist treatments of the relationship between basic and non-basic beliefs. In our view, foundationalism is a better view of epistemic justification than is coherentism, but the listener will have to reach his or her own conclusions about this issue. Four, virtue epistemology. In Part 5, we will examine various ethical systems and discover that most of them, for example, utilitarianism, deontological theories, focus on discerning the correct moral rules and right and wrong moral acts. The moral agent himself is left out of the picture. But one very important ethical system, virtue ethics, backs away from making moral rules and actions its primary focus. Instead, its primary concern is to clarify the nature of the good person and the sorts of virtues and character traits that characterize such a person. And a right act is one that is done by a good person with a developed set of properly ordered virtues. In the same way, foundationalism and coherentism focus on the structure of justification and try to discern correct epistemic rules and beliefs. But virtue epistemology zeroes in on the notion of an intellectual virtue and the sort of virtues that characterize a rational agent. Thus, a justified or warranted belief would be one produced by a virtuous knower when exercising his epistemic virtues properly. Intellectual virtues are those qualities and capacities of a good thinker or knower. We may think of them as habits that perfect the intellect for the proper, effective consideration of truth. Current virtue epistemologists think of intellectual virtues either as reliable or truth-conducive cognitive faculties, for example, vision, hearing, memory, introspection, or as good intellectual character traits like attentiveness, open-mindedness, and intellectual courage. Accordingly, there are two main varieties of virtue epistemology: reliabilist or faculty-based virtue epistemology. On this view, intellectual virtues are qualities that help to maximize one's surplus of truth over error. For example, memory, perception, introspection, intuitive reason. These virtues are identified with the various faculties that exhibit them, and the faculties count as intellectually virtuous because they are epistemically reliable. Thus, the approach is known as virtue reliabilism or faculty-based virtue epistemology. One problem for this approach is the difficulty of accounting for high-grade knowledge. Virtue reliabilists hold that a true belief is knowledge only if its high epistemic status is explainable in terms of a proper exercise of the knower's reliable faculties. For example, such an account seems to work for one's knowing that the sun is shining. One has this knowledge only if this belief is true, and its high epistemic status for the knower is explainable in terms of the reliable functioning of his visual faculties. But consider the task of forming true beliefs that are less mundane, and in fact, quite difficult to acquire. For example, about subatomic particles, the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire, or certain sorts of theological knowledge. In many of these cases, knowledge will be credited to a subject not in terms of his clear vision, good hearing, and so forth. Rather, knowledge will be credited on the basis of persistent curiosity, hard work, open-mindedness, intellectual honesty, and so forth. These qualities, not the knower's cognitive faculties, will explain why the person has knowledge. Responsibilist, or character-based virtue epistemology. On the view of responsibilist, or character-based virtue epistemology, intellectual virtues are likened to moral virtues, for example, as good intellectual character traits, such as attentiveness, fair-mindedness, intellectual tenacity, and honesty. These intellectual virtues are aimed at epistemic goods such as knowledge and understanding. So understood, intellectual virtues are character traits of a responsible knower, whereas reliabilist theories tend to treat the goal of human cognition as little more than the acquisition of true beliefs about the external world. Responsibilists tend to focus on a richer set of cognitive goals, such as knowledge and understanding, insight and wisdom. One problem with this approach is that various forms of knowledge seem to be achieved quite independently of exercising or even possessing intellectual virtues. For example, immediate knowledge of one's own mental states, or perceptual knowledge of one's surroundings. Virtue epistemology is an interesting development in the last few decades of epistemic reflection, and it remains to be seen just how predominant it will become in the future. Chapter Summary. The debate between foundationalism and coherentism is primarily focused on different normative views about a noetic structure. Foundationalists distinguish between basic and non-basic beliefs. Properly basic beliefs are those basic beliefs not justified by other beliefs, even though they can be grounded in some other way. There is an asymmetry between basic and non-basic beliefs, and the basing relation is irreflexive and asymmetrical. Different versions of foundationalism include strong and weak foundationalism. Foundationalists offer at least three main arguments for their view: the role of experience and perceptual beliefs in justification, the basic nature of certain truths of reason, and the regress argument. Coherentists attack the incorrigibility of the foundations, a thesis central to strong foundationalism. Many coherentists claim that all perception is theory-laden, and they criticize foundationalist views of the transfer of justification. Coherence theories of justification accept the doxastic assumption, the view that the sole factor that justifies a belief for a person is other beliefs. Moreover, coherentists deny the asymmetry between basic and non-basic beliefs. Third, coherentists differ over the nature of coherence itself, with logical consistency, entailment, explanatory power, and probability being among the most popular views. Finally, there are different versions of coherentism, including linear and holistic coherentism. Much of the support for coherentism lies in the alleged inadequacies of foundationalism and the superiority of coherence views of how our beliefs are actually justified. Foundationalists claim that coherence theories, at least positive linear ones, are viciously circular, that all coherence theories are implausible accounts of how at least perceptual beliefs are justified, and that coherence theories leave no room for sensory experiences to play a positive epistemological role in justification. Foundationalists cite the isolation problem and the plurality objection as difficulties for coherence theories. Finally, virtue epistemology has developed in the past few decades and can be subdivided into reliabilist or faculty-based and responsibilist or character-based versions. Chapter 6. Theories of Truth and Postmodernism. To say of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, is true. Aristotle. Metaphysics, page 1077, B, line 26. If a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, but if the thing does not take place or prove true, it is a word that the Lord has not spoken. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 22. Pilate asked, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king." For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" John chapter 18, verses 37 through 38. 1. Introduction. Down through the ages, people have asked Pilate's question, "Is there such a thing as truth? And if so, what exactly is it?" The Christian religion, as well as its rivals, essentially contains claims about reality, which are either true or false. Moreover, competing truth claims, especially those at the core of competing worldviews, often have very different consequences for life. As C.S. Lewis put it, "We are now getting to the point at which different beliefs about the universe lead to different behavior. Religion involves a series of statements about facts, which must be either true or false. If they are true, one set of conclusions will follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they are false, quite a different set." The notion of truth employed in Lewis's statement is called the correspondence theory of truth. Roughly, the idea that truth is a matter of proposition, belief, thought, statement, representation, corresponding to reality. Truth obtains when reality is the way a proposition represents it to be. The correspondence theory of truth may properly be called the classical theory of truth, because with very little exception, it was held by virtually everyone until the 19th century. However, since then, the correspondence theory has come under criticism, and alternative theories of truth have been formulated. Moreover, according to many of its advocates, an important contemporary ideology, postmodernism, rejects the existence of truth, especially if it is construed according to some version of the correspondence theory. In order to get at these issues, this chapter is divided into two sections: theories of truth and postmodernism. In the first section, after looking at some preliminary issues, a correspondence theory of truth will be analyzed and evaluated, followed by a discussion of alternative theories of truth. In the second section, different aspects of postmodernism will be presented and assessed. 2. Theories of truth. 2.1. Preliminary issues. Is there a biblical view of truth? The answer seems to be no and yes, depending on what one means. No, there is no peculiarly Christian theory of truth, one that is used only in the Bible and not elsewhere. If there were a peculiarly Christian view of truth, two disastrous implications would follow. Claims that certain Christian doctrines are true would be equivocal compared to ordinary, everyday assertions of truth, and Christianity's claim to be true would be circular or system-dependent and therefore trivial. Further, the Bible does not use technical philosophical vocabulary to proffer a precise theory of truth, nor is advocation of a specific theory of truth the primary intent of scriptural teaching. However, none of this means that biblical teaching does not presuppose or make the most sense in light of a particular theory of truth. The Old and New Testament terms for truth are, respectively, emet and aletheia. The meaning of these terms, and more generally a biblical conception of truth, are broad and multifaceted. Fidelity